Have you ever received a phone call from a number that you didn't know? What was your first thought? That, oh, they're probably just calling me about my car's extended warranty, so you sent them to voicemail? That's the thought that most of us have when we receive a call from an unknown number, and usually it's just a scam, and nothing to worry about so long as you didn't answer it and end up sending them thousands of dollars worth of gift cards. But what if you had answered that unknown number, and it turns out that you were wrong? What if that caller had more malicious intentions than simply calling to try to scam you out of a couple $1,000s? What if you had seen something just shortly a few nights before that nobody should know that you had seen, but somehow this caller knows what you saw in detail? Well, something very similar to this happened to a man named Gary Sudbrink back in February of 1993. Gary Sudbrink was a captain in the Air Force, and strange calls were not the only thing that had happened to him. In fact, many strange things would happen to him before he even received these calls. He and his family would experience a range of strange occurrences that would lead Gary into believing a strange group of people that today we have coined the Men in Black were after him and plotting something against him that he had no interest in allowing to unfold. And if you're new here, welcome to my channel. My name is Richard. This is our first episode of a new series that we're doing called the Men in Black Files. Now, let's begin with the full story of Gary Subdrink. As I mentioned earlier, the phone calls were not only the main thing that happened to this 27-year-old Air Force captain. In fact, he would experience a multitude of strange occurrences. To truly put all of this into perspective, we have to go back before any of these strange occurrences even took place. Or I should say, took place and involved Gary himself. You see, Gary lived by himself in Texas, but his family and many of his friends lived in New York, which is where he grew up. This meant that in order to see his family, he would have to go to New York every so often to see them. And in 1992, a year prior to these strange phone calls that Gary would inevitably receive when he visits his family, Gary's father had also investigated an alleged UFO crash with a group of researchers from the Long Island UFO group, and witnessed a UFO with Gary's uncle just a couple weeks prior when they were visiting West Virginia. That makes it a little more strange when you actually get into the context of what happened in these phone calls, and you need to keep all of these close encounters that Gary's father had in mind when they become relevant later, as the caller will say some things that will spark Gary's father's interest, if you will. But the strange occurrences for Gary and his family actually started back in 1992, not long after Gary's father had first investigated this alleged UFO crash. And when the alleged calls happened, it was only a couple of weeks prior to these calls that Gary's father had actually seen a UFO over West Virginia, just to put this into context. Now, Gary had a younger brother, and his name was Steven, and Steven was actually on his way to his wedding back in 1992 when the first occurrence happened. As when he was on his way to the wedding, he saw what he believed was his brother's car driving alongside him. They were rather close to one another and heading in the same direction. But this didn't really make any sense to Steven, because Gary should have already been at the wedding, and Steven should have actually been there after Gary. So Steven had just assumed that maybe this car was just someone similar to Gary, or similar to Gary's car, and really didn't think anything much of it until the car pulled up directly next to Steven. When the car pulled up directly next to him, he could actually see the driver, and the driver indeed was his brother Gary. However, it was weird because his brother was making strange faces at him, distorted faces that, quite frankly, creeped Steven out. And he assumed that Gary was just trying to play a prank on him during his wedding day, and this kind of upset Steven, because this was supposed to be his special day. However, when Steven would arrive at the wedding, he would find that Gary was already there. And obviously this confused Steven a bit, but he goes up to Gary and he says, "Hey, why were you messing with me on the way here? You were making strange faces at me. What's your deal, man?" And Gary seemed to have no idea what Steven was talking about. It turns out that Gary had actually flown from Texas, and his car was not there. It was actually back in the garage in Texas. However, Steven really didn't believe Gary because he knew what he saw, and this sparked an argument between the two brothers, But that's as far as this would go. Obviously, Stephen wasn't happy, but Gary was just confused and didn't really know what to make of this situation. But with the power of hindsight and with this information in mind, we could surmise that someone may have been impersonating Gary, or maybe it could just be a coincidence that somebody that happened to look an awful lot like Gary with the exact same car would try to mess with his brother Stephen. I know that doesn't really seem plausible, it's kind of ridiculous, but hey, it's a theory. And as I mentioned, Gary was a member of the Air Force in the early 1990s, and this is going to become more relevant. I'm talking back to the doppelganger part of it, which Stephen claims to have seen, when we get to the phone calls later in the story. Now, at the time, Gary was working as a pharmacist on a base in San Antonio, Texas. In early February of 1993, he would realize that he would have 3 days off in a row this upcoming weekend, and decided that it would be good to go and visit his family and friends in New York, since his brother's wedding was the last time that he had actually seen any of them, and that was a year prior. So he decided to jump on the opportunity and catch a flight to New York City. Another strange occurrence would happen to Gary, though, the afternoon before Gary was supposed to leave for New York. And this would actually cause Gary to want to speak with his father about this strange occurrence. You see, he was alone in his apartment and heard a strange noise coming from out back of his apartment that sounded like rotors from a helicopter. This helicopter sounded like it was right next to him, and this prompted Gary to get up and walk out back onto his balcony so that he could try to see what was going on. Gary saw just past the fence of his apartment a helicopter that was hovering about 20 feet off the ground and pointed directly in his direction, facing his apartment. And Gary, just as most people would think, thought this was strange. I mean, why would there be a random helicopter in my backyard? Gary was a bit nearsighted though, so he had to run into his apartment and grab his glasses so that he could actually see the details of the helicopter better and maybe try to figure out who this helicopter belonged to. However, Gary was a bit too slow, and by the time he got back from grabbing his glasses, the helicopter had already risen in altitude, and Gary could no longer make out the details of it as he watched it fly away. And as anyone would, Gary wondered why a random helicopter would be out back of his apartment facing him, and what they could possibly want with him if it was at all actually related to him. I mean, what person or agency with enough money would actually take up an interest in Gary and simply stalk his apartment with a helicopter? I mean, it's kind of ridiculous, and because of this, Gary did try to shrug it off, thinking, well, maybe it's just pure coincidence and it's nothing. And Gary just wasn't sure about the situation. So he finished packing, he's a little shook, but he shrugs it off and gets ready to go to New York, which later that evening he does. He goes to the airport. Gary's now at the airport at his flight's terminal and waiting to board. He's got his boarding pass in hand, waiting for them to call his number so that he can get onto his plane, when some random stranger decides to walk up to Gary and start striking up a conversation with him. This random stranger was a slim man with brown hair and an overcoat. The strange man started to try and talk to Gary, and when the man said hello, Gary responded in kind as not to be rude, thinking maybe this guy was just bored and wanted someone to talk to before the flight took off. That was until this man started asking Gary some personal questions. He asked Gary where he was going, and Gary told him that he was heading to New York City to visit friends and family, and he also told the stranger that he worked at a nearby Air Force base. For what reason, I'm not sure, but Gary apparently told him that. During this conversation, Gary saw a small notebook in the man's hand, and the strange man asked Gary what his name was, and he responded and told him his name was Gary, but the strange man began to press him for what his full name was, and this obviously started to weird Gary out. Gary was actually in his Air Force uniform at the time, and he did have on his name badge, but his last name was actually covered by his jacket. Then Gary realized that as the conversation was going on, the strange man was actually writing the information that Gary was telling him down in a notebook, the one that I mentioned earlier. This obviously weirded Gary out, and paired with the weird incidents with the helicopter that had just happened not that long ago, the situation was obviously a little weird for Gary. With Gary obviously thinking that something strange is going on, he really wanted to exit this conversation as quickly as possible. and he had no idea who this man was or why this man's writing information down about him, but he had no interest in finding out. Then the man, realizing that he was losing his grip on the conversation with Gary, exclaimed that he was starting a small business and was surveying the airport for what Gary assumed was potential clients. That is, until Gary realized that he actually hadn't seen this man go up and talk to any of the other passengers. Why was this man so interested in Gary? Well, the man began to ask Gary for his full name, and Gary asked him why he needed it, and the man told Gary, "Don't worry, you won't get into any trouble." This obviously made no sense to Gary and only served to weird him out even further. Gary was getting fed up and was desperately looking for a way out of this conversation, and his row was called just at that time, so he immediately grabbed his things, said goodbye, boarded the airplane, and said not another word to the strange man that had been asking him these weird questions just moments prior. Gary anxiously boarded his flight, still weirded out from the encounter with that man, when another man with long hair and glasses took a seat directly next to Gary. This man also began to strike up a conversation with Gary, although weirded out by the previous interaction, Gary really didn't think this one was quite as unusual. He had assumed that since he'd be sitting next to this man on their entire trip to New York, that this conversation didn't really seem all that out of the ordinary, so they talked for a bit until another passenger holding his boarding pass came up and told the man, "Hey, you're in my seat, you need to move." The man complied, got up, and allowed the passenger to take his seat, and then proceeded to move across the aisle from Gary and continue to try to talk to Gary. That's when the questions suddenly got weirder and more personal. Much like the man in the airport, he started to ask Gary, "Where you going? What's your name? Your full name?" Those sorts of questions. Then he proceeded to ask when Gary would be returning to his home in Texas. Finally, a stewardess would come up to the man and tell him, "Hey, buddy, you're in the wrong seat. You gotta go to your actual seat." So the man stood up, stood next to the emergency exit just a row away from Gary, and the man, knowing that he would have to move soon, began to pelt Gary with even more questions. These questions still were similar to what the man in the airport terminal had been asking. How long would he be in New York? Gary refused to answer any of these questions. "What's your full name, Gary?" You know, all of that sort of stuff that you just wouldn't want to give out to a random stranger. Eventually, the flight attendant returned yet again and told the man, "Look, buddy, you need to take your seat." So he did, because they were getting ready to take off, and obviously he can't just stand there next to the emergency exit the whole flight. The man's actual seat turned out to be much further back on the plane, and Gary did not see this man again for the entire remainder of the flight. Obviously, both of these interactions left Gary a bit creeped out, thinking maybe it was possible that these men were planning to rob his house. Gary decided to call his landlord upon landing and asked if they would keep an eye on his apartment while he was away, explaining that he thought that these weird men may be planning to burglarize his home. He then got into a cab and headed to his parents' place, and when he made it to his parents' house the next evening, Gary had a conversation with his father about the helicopter that had been hovering around his property just the day prior. Gary's father thought that this was weird, not just because it was a strange story, but also because he had also seen a helicopter flying over his house earlier that same day. This didn't do Gary any favors. Gary then decided that he wanted to try and meet up with his friend Mike, so he gave Mike a call because he hadn't seen Mike in a long time. Mike answered the phone and he told Mike that he was in the area, and Mike responded saying, "Wow, you sound better already." And "Yeah, I know, Gary, you just told me 20 minutes ago you were in the area, we just spoke on the phone." This obviously confused Gary, since Gary had not actually called Mike, and he hadn't told anybody that he was planning to come to New York. Mike explained that somebody which sounded exactly like Gary, but a little bit sick and with a staticky phone connection, had called him and told him that he was in the area and wanted to meet up. The person had also told Mike that he had flown in to a different airport than the airport that Gary actually flew in from. Gary was obviously confused and had no clue what to make of any of this. Suddenly, a beeping began on the phone line, signaling that another call was trying to come in. At this point, it was 10:30 p.m., and Gary had assumed that this has to be important because of how late it is, so he quickly tells Mike, "Hey, there's another call coming in, I gotta answer this, I'll call you back." He went ahead and answered the call, and this call was extremely weird. Gary realized almost immediately that he would need to record this conversation. He hit the record button on the answering machine and kept the conversation with the strange voice on the other line going. The voice on the line was a strange, inhuman, almost robotic sounding voice. This voice would proceed to repeatedly call Gary, and this would be the first of many weird phone calls that Gary would receive while he was at his parents' house that night. Gary recorded all of them as soon as he heard the weird voice on the other end. And this was the first phone call which Gary received.
This. I'll tell you who it is.
Hello?
Yeah. Do you want to speak to him?
Is Gary Sudbrink there?
Yeah, who's this? Steven? Are you playing games with me or what? Huh? Steven, if you're playing games, I'm going to kick your ass.
So how long are you going to be back from Texas?
Huh?
You're being impersonated by the other voice.
Yeah, this is you, Steven, you idiot. You're pissing me off. You jerk. I'm going to get you on... Let's see what it says. Review. One new call out of area. Is Steven out of the area?
How long are you going to be back from Texas?
Wait, say that again?
You're being impersonated by the other voice.
Wait, hold on. Is Steven out of the calling area or what?
How do I know?
What do you mean you don't know? He's in Queens. Well, who are you talking to? I don't know who the fuck.
Hello?
Hello?
Is Gary Sudbrink there?
Who is this? Sounds like a freaking robot.
So
Hello?
how long are you going to be back from Texas?
What was that again, sir?
You're being impersonated by the other voice.
Oh, be quiet, Alpha. Sorry, would you see that again? Hello? Being impersonated by what voice?
Hello?
Yeah. Hello?
Is Gary Sudbrink there?
Yeah, hold on a second. Yeah, what is your question? I'll answer it.
So how long are you going to be back from Texas?
How long?
You're being impersonated by the other voice.
Right. When am I coming back? Is that your question? Okay, there was a break. Hold on. You want to know when I'm coming back to Texas? Oh, is that your question?
So how long are you going to be back from Texas?
How long am I going to be back from Texas? That question doesn't make any sense.
By the other voice.
Okay. I'll be coming back eventually. I can't tell you when. You should know that question, the answer to the questions, because you seem to know more about me than I do. You know what I'm saying?
Are you an intergalactic person?
Are you a space alien?
Sounds like he hung up.
I can't believe this.
He hung up, Gary.
See if he comes back.
All right, I'll hang up.
When Gary first answered the phone, he assumed that it was his brother Steven calling and trying to play a prank on him. But with the realization that it's an out-of-area number, coupled with the phone static and all the weird occurrences that had happened to Gary earlier that day, he became a bit more concerned with what these calls may actually be all about. As Gary mentioned, the caller phrased his words strange, pointing out during the call that the question, "How long will you be back from Texas?" Doesn't really make any sense, considering that Gary actually lives in Texas and he was visiting New York, as the caller should be aware. It also seemed as if the caller was running out of energy during the phone call, repeating many of the same phrases over and over again, but getting quieter as the call went on, almost like a machine with the dying battery. Gary thought that it was weird and almost like someone was trying to play a prank on him. He figured maybe somebody had a soundboard and was repeatedly playing the same creepy phrases slowed down over and over again, but at the time, soundboards were not that readily available without being in something like a professional studio. Don't forget this was in the early 1990s, and at points the caller was actually interactive enough to make Gary believe that it couldn't possibly have been somebody playing a prank on him, and it actually had to be somebody on the other end of the phone. And realizing that his brother should be in Queens and not out of the area, he came to the realization that there's likely no way that this could actually be his brother Steven messing with him. The most disturbing part of this call, however, is the caller stating, "You're being impersonated by the other voice." And that's really strange when you consider what happened to his brother Steven just a year prior, and also Mike just minutes earlier when he told Gary that he had already spoken with him. So obviously that part was quite unsettling. Was someone out there impersonating Gary, a doppelganger? None of this really made any sense to Gary, and he quickly called Mike back, and after this call was finished, he told Mike what had just happened. He tried to pry some more information out of Mike about the guy that called him pretending to be Gary, and eventually the phone call with Mike ended. However, 40 minutes later, the phone would ring yet again.
What is your question? Yes, speaking. Yes. Could I answer any questions for you?
Are you back from Texas?
Not back yet, no.
How long are you going to be back from Texas?
Let me answer. First, you tell me, where are you calling from?
This is Gary Sudbrink.
Yeah, why don't you tell me where you're calling from?
Who is this?
What do you mean, who is this? You should know who it is. It's me, Gary. Wait, let me ask you this question. Where are you calling from? Okay, I'll be back. Excuse me? I can't hear too well. Yeah, it is a full moon out. That's true. Could you identify yourself? Identify yourself. Why are you calling me? Excuse me? I cannot hear too well.
Get on the other phone, it's better.
Hold on, let me switch phones.
Okay.
Okay, hold on. Now, who are you?
Keep an eye in the sky, he said.
Keep an eye in the sky?
Yeah.
Ask him, can I talk to him?
Shh, shh.
I had a sighting over.
Okay, hold on. Say that. Repeat that again. Please repeat. Okay.
Near Orion.
Near Orion. Holy mackerel. Tonight or guess on when? The full moon. They told
So, double from here.
Repeat.
Tell them I like you. Okay, repeat last word. I'm hearing static.
Tell him I like to talk to him.
He hung up.
He hung up.
Hello?
This time around, it was much harder to make out what the voice was saying. From what we could tell, the voice repeatedly told Gary to keep an eye on the skies and watch the constellation of Orion, and also to do this during a full moon. During the call, all of this grabs the attention of Gary's father, and Gary's father, being interested in UFOs and having seen the things he saw, immediately assumed that this caller must be a spaceman, a visitor from another world calling about his UFO sightings, and that this really actually had nothing to do with Gary. The story continues from here to get even weirder, because at 11:38 p.m., the phone would proceed to ring yet again.
Okay. Yeah, it's taking time for him to talk. Who is this? Stephen, this is not funny, you know.
Brian, it's not Steven.
What do you mean, Brian?
I mean, Gary.
How do I know it's not Stephen?
It's not Steven. Hello? I had a UFO experience in West Virginia, which you probably know. And I know that you're into an intergalactic person. Can you speak a little louder? Sir? Can you speak a little louder? Louder?
Let me speak to him, Dad. I guess I don't know what.
All right, I'll hang up so you can talk to him. He wants to talk to you.
Okay. Hello, can I help you?
Hello.
Yes.
You're Gary Subdrink.
Yes, that's me.
Your name is Gary Subdrink.
Yes, could you please identify yourself? Identify.
Oh, you're back from Texas.
Yeah, I'm back. I'm in Texas right now. Oh, he asked me a question. No, I'm in New York right now. You know that. Why are you asking me such a question? Yes. Stephen, if this is you, I swear to God, I'm going to be pissed. Huh? I'm trying to listen to him. Excuse me? Okay. Eventually I'll be back from Texas. Could you speak more? Please speak more. I guess it's not Stephen. I believe it because I'm getting static. Let me go on this phone because I can never hear on this phone. Hold on. Okay. Okay, please speak. Hello?
Keep an eye on the sky.
Okay. Should I go out right now?
Right.
Right now?
The full moon.
Okay, see, I'm not sure where Orion is now, but we'll go outside.
Show double from you.
It would show double from me. Repeat that again?
Gary starts this call, again calling out the caller for probably being his brother, hoping that this is just a prank, but quickly admits that there's really no way that this could be Steven because of the static on the other end of the call. At this point, Gary is clearly disturbed, you can hear it in his voice. And to make things even creepier, the strange voice on the other end of the call says, "We show double of you," which obviously grabs Gary's attention since he's already concerned that someone may be out there now impersonating impersonating him. The caller also continues to tell Gary to keep an eye on the skies and to watch Orion. During this phone call, Gary's dad was actually listening in on the other line and could hear the strange voice, but he could barely make out what the voice was saying. Almost as though with each call and strange new message, the caller was running out of energy. This may very well have been the case, since the Sudbrink family wouldn't receive any more calls that night from the strange voice. Gary and his family then decided to head to bed, but the thought of the mysterious calls haunted him for the rest of the night, as he had no idea what was going on, and he's just sitting there in bed thinking, am I being impersonated? Is my house about to be robbed when I get home? Could the helicopter and strange man at the airport have anything to do with these mysterious calls? All of these thoughts were circling Gary's mind as he laid there in bed that night, and even stranger is that this call happened while Gary was on the phone with his friend Mike, and Mike had just told him about a strange caller that was impersonating Gary. It was as if the strange caller that had called Gary was actually spying and listening in on his phone call with his friend Mike. Now, maybe this could be a coincidence, but the timing is definitely odd, and the next day went by without anything weird happening until about 10:21 p.m. the next night, when the Sudbrink phone would ring yet again.
Yes, this is me. Can I speak to you? Can I ask why you're... Yes, can I ask why you're calling? Can I please ask... Yes, this is. Yes, that is me. Say that again?
This planet.
Leave?
We come
I'm staying right here.
to be within this planet.
Is this a joke or what?
To many. To be contact. As the same with you.
I have to think about that. I'd like to see you.
To many. To be contact. As the same with you.
Hey, let me tell you something. I've been listening to you, and I've had contacts with you.
Beware. Government interference.
Government interference? You have? Please explain what type of interference.
Beware.
Okay.
Government interference. Visitations to be disrupted by them. Appears. Sun will rise from dark side of world. No.
The sun will rise from the dark side of the moon.
Okay, what branch of the government? What should I do?
Beware. Government interference. Visitations to be disrupted by them.
Okay. Is that good for me or bad? They hung up.
Yeah.
As you guys can probably tell, this call was much different than the previous calls. Short of the familiar "is Gary Subdrink there" line, we get a whole host of new information, with the most interesting part being comments about government interference, which Gary asked, "Is that good or bad for me?" He doesn't know. He has no idea what this caller is talking about. Maybe the government was aware of the impersonator and attempting to stop them, or maybe the government was impersonating Gary. Neither one is really good news. The caller also mentions that the government is blocking visitation, almost seemingly insinuating that the caller was an extraterrestrial being from the constellation Orion and was attempting to visit Gary, but being stopped by the government interference. Whatever the truth of the matter actually is, it's definitely an unpleasant situation for Gary and his family to have found themselves in. And with what this caller was saying, it kind of makes sense to try to link Gary's father's and his uncle's UFO encounters to the phone calls, almost as though the beings that were flying the craft that they both witnessed were messing with them and now impersonating his son. And they were trying to give Gary's dad and uncle a scare. Gary has not experienced any more calls since this last call that I just shared with you, but he has claimed to have experienced other sorts of strange phenomenon, such as poltergeist activity in his home, but he's never given an interview actually elaborating on any of this. And now it's entirely possible that these calls simply could have been made by someone using a device to change their voice, and this was just to attempt to prank Gary, and the timing was just bad. This has been theorized. However, this doesn't account for the strange encounters that Gary Subdrink had at the airport when he was on the plane and before he boarded, as well as the strange helicopter seemingly spying on him and his father. Whatever the case may be, Gary is still convinced that these calls were definitely not a prank, and that if they were, someone may have been trying to keep his father and uncle quiet about their UFO encounter. Whatever the case may be, they are still definitely disturbing, and no one has really come up with a good solid explanation. For one, nobody has ever admitted to the phone calls, and there is a rumor that rather than simply going straight to Gary's parents' house, like most versions of this story suggest, that Gary had actually first went with his father to speak to a known UFO expert about what Gary's father and uncle had witnessed in the weeks prior in the skies of West Virginia. These calls supposedly happened only a couple of hours after this meeting took place. This would keep in line with the lure of Men in Black attempting to scare UFO witnesses into no longer speaking or investigating events that the witnesses may have been witness to, as well as alleged rumors of Men in Black having an interest in prominent UFO investigators and what they actually know about UFOs. Maybe Gary's dad flew a little too close to the sun, and this caused his family to have an encounter with these people. Unfortunately, we have no real way of knowing, but the story is still definitely a strange one to say the least, and this version may just be a rumor with nothing to it. The reason that Gary's father and uncle were apparently in West Virginia to investigate in the first place was the fact that they were investigating an observatory. You see, as I mentioned earlier, they were part of the Long Island UFO group, so they would go and do these expeditions to try to find UFOs and look for evidence. And this particular observatory that they were going to visit had rumored to have been destroyed by a UFO just years prior. And as I mentioned, the night that they went to West Virginia, while they were at this observatory, they did witness what they claimed was a UFO hovering above them, and this is the main reason that Gary's father and uncle were convinced that it was possible that the caller on the other end simply was not a human, but rather an extraterrestrial trying to contact them. But again, there is no proof that this is truly the case, aside from their speculation on the subject, and the observatory would later be used by the Breakthrough Listen project to look for extraterrestrial life, funnily enough. Also, the Breakthrough Listen project was recently in the news. This was because just a couple months back, Professor Simon Williams was claiming on YouTube that he was told by the head of the project that they would soon likely be disclosing that they found alien life in a signal known as Breakthrough Listen 1. This was one series of 5 signals that they were investigating that could possibly have originated from alien life in outer space. But so far, however, no news has actually come of this alleged announcement. There's theories that maybe Gary, though, had used something called a talk boy, which had released a couple of months prior to change his voice in order to hoax this phone call, as well as people having sped up the voice which when sped up sounds much more normal.
So how long are you going to be back from Texas?
Some people actually claim that the voice when sped up sounds like Gary. I don't personally believe it does, but it's entirely possible that maybe this could have been a hoax that was created by the Subdrink family, or maybe just a prank caller. Gary obviously, though, does not believe in the Talkboy theory, citing that all the other strange occurrences actually happened to him, and that this Talkboy theory doesn't actually explain any of them. Also a bit weird when put together with the fact that the voice claimed that Gary was being impersonated, as well as Mike claiming to have spoke to Gary earlier, and personally I don't think the voice sounds at all like Gary when sped up, or at least not an exact match. There is a slight pitch difference, and his New York accent that's very apparent when Gary speaks is just not there. So if this was not a hoax or a prank call, is it possible that the person impersonating Gary may have actually been using a voice changer to call Gary simply to mess with him? Unfortunately, we also don't have an answer for that and likely never will. I would like to add, though, that Gary never tried to monetize any of this. He never wrote a book, and he never took any money for interviews, so maybe that helps his credibility some into the eyes of those studying this case. With that being said, I hope that you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please tap that subscribe button and notification bell on your way out, as well as the like button, and I would greatly appreciate your comments and feedback. Let me know any other cases, maybe, that you want me to investigate in the future. I have a whole list of other ones I'm definitely doing. This is just the first of many of a series of cases that we've been working on. And yeah, I hope to see you guys in the next one. Peace.